So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the sixth lecture in our series, Borders, Boundaries, Belonging and Borders, which is part of the Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon Borough Council's Peace for Decade of Commemorations programme. And we have, I see our council officers with us this evening, Nicola and Evia. My name is Therese Cullen and I am the facilitator for the series. And this evening's lecture is by Dr. Isabella Jackson, and her talk is on the history of Hong Kong. And Dr. Isabella Jackson is the assistant professor in Chinese history at Trinity College, where she teaches many aspects of modern Chinese and imperial history. She's the author of Shaping Modern Shanghai, Colonialism in China's Global City, which is published by Cambridge University Press. And she's co-edited with Robert Vickers, the Treaty Ports in Modern China, Law and Power, which is published in 2016. And her current project is funded by a major grant from the Irish Research Council, which examines 20th century decline of child slavery in China and what it reveals about the changing conceptions of childhood. So Dr. Isabella Jackson, you're very welcome and we're so delighted that you're here. Thank you for joining us this evening. So I'll stop sharing the screen and let you introduce yourself and share.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Please forgive the background noise. Can everyone see that clearly?
Yes.
Great. So thank you very much for inviting me to lecture series and to everyone for coming on a lovely sunny evening. And I was delighted that Hong Kong was included in this series because it's always been an important part of the world to know about, but I think particularly at the moment with recent events. So to put some of that into historical context, I think could be very useful. And also for your wider theme of borders, boundaries, belonging and bonds, I think Hong Kong has a lot to say. So I'll bear those kind of motifs in mind as we move through the lecture. And I'm going to give you a kind of potted history, starting in pre-colonial Hong Kong very briefly, and then through the colonial years and up to the present. And Hong Kong was a kind of an outpost in many ways. It was a bridge between China and the West, particularly in the Hong Kong, in the Cold War era. It was at times an isolated island, not just in the Cold War, but also during the Second World War, and a late outpost of colonialism. Quite an outlier in all sorts of ways. So it's a really interesting case study, and it also is home to people with multiple identities and overlapping hybrid identities. You can be at once British, Chinese, and Hong Kong in Hong Kong. So those are the sorts of themes that we'll be touching on. So this is a lovely old Chinese map from around about 1800 showing the whole of China. And you can see right down in the bottom right-hand side of the mainland, there's two little round lumps, and they are Macau and Hong Kong. So you know, it's important not to fall into the trap of accepting the kind of British colonial narrative that Hong Kong was sort of not there, or just a lump of rock before the British turned up. It was seen as significant enough to include in this map, and it's actually enlarged. It's physically bigger than it is in reality, which shows that it was seen as strategically useful. The British weren't the first colonial players on the stage in this area. Macau, just next door to Hong Kong, was actually claimed as a Portuguese colony as early as 1557. But the Portuguese used it as a trading post, but didn't really get that involved in the day-to-day running of society. So they were quite kind of arm's length with their style of colonialism. The name Hong Kong in Mandarin is Xiangang, but Cantonese is closer to Hong Kong, and that means fragrant harbour. So right from the outset, you know, the harbour is at the heart of Hong Kong. It is, it's all about trade. And that's why it's strategically useful, first of all, in China, whether it's the Song dynasty, which established a garrison there, the Qing, which maintain it, which was the last dynasty in China, and then why the British wanted it. There were schools in China as early as the 11th or 12th century, but it mostly was used by what were called boat people. So these are people from an ethnic minority in China who do live on boats and are very sort of nomadic and involved in fishing and then also piracy. So it didn't have a great reputation within China. It was associated with smuggling and piracy. Then we get to the First Opium War, which, if anyone doesn't know, is as bad as it sounds. The British literally went to war with China, trying to insist on them allowing the British to sell narcotics to them. Opium at the time was legal in Britain and most of Europe, but was illegal in China. But it was the one product that the British had hit upon that they could sell in large quantities to China. They wanted to buy a lot of Chinese tea and silk and porcelain and chinoiserie, and the only product that the British could get hold of from British India that China wanted to consume in large quantities was opium. So this is a warehouse in British India, and each of those little round lumps is opium. So this was the form in which it was packed and then shipped over to China. And it had become a crisis by the 1830s, and the Qing government was trying to crack down on how many people were getting addicted to opium. And so they dumped a load of opium in the sea, and the British merchants felt that this was theft and rallied their kind of contacts in London to get the Parliament to vote to approve to send the Royal Navy over and go to war. And it was a close debate. You know, there's an argument that some people use that you can't judge history by contemporary standards, but you can judge it by its own standards. And there were plenty of people in the British Parliament who thought that this was abhorrent. And it was a close debate, so a close vote in the Commons. So this was understood by many people at the time to be wrong, but nonetheless, the war went ahead, and the British just had superior shipping. You know, at the time the Royal Navy was the greatest navy in the world, and the first ever steamship, the Nemesis, was used in the First Opium War. And beg pardon, that's the motorbike setting off in the background. So, you know, the Qing didn't have anything that could withstand that. It still took a while. You know, 1839 the war broke out, and it was not until 1841 that it was concluded. 1842 that the treaty was signed, and that was the Treaty of Nanjing, signed in the city of Nanjing, not far from Shanghai. Hong Kong was the only colony that was ceded to Britain in that treaty, and then also 5 treaty ports were granted to Britain, and they were just bases where British people could settle for trade. They weren't, the territory did not belong to Britain. So Hong Kong is the only little colony that Britain got. And you can see the treaty ports marked on this map. So it was useful to the British. They used it in the Opium War as a base. They saw its strategic importance, and that's why they wanted it. Initially, it was this small island in the south, Hong Kong Island. So the actual island was all that was ceded as a colony, but that was added to later. So although the First Opium War was won by the British, didn't actually get their key demand, which was for opium to be legalized in China. And for that reason, various others, they went to war with China again in the Second Opium War. And that was when Kowloon was granted to the British in 1860. And then in the Boxer War of 1898, the British claimed this wider area, the New Territories, as it's called, and the outlying islands. And that was the area that was granted on a 99-year lease, which would become very pertinent. You may well have heard about the 99-year lease. But Hong Kong Island and Kowloon proper were actually granted in perpetuity. It's only the New Territories that was on the lease, but that became a bit of a legal complication, and we'll come to that later. So in the early days, it was a base for trade. And on the left here, you've got Jardine House, the first incarnation. You can see it's a very colonial style building. The British brought over the kind of architecture they used in India and Burma and such places. And Jardines was the arch opium traders. It was the Jardine Mathesons who had pushed really hard for the Opium War in the first place. They were still very involved in opium trade right through the 19th century until it was made illegal in the early 20th century. And then they were involved in all sorts of other import and export. And all sorts of multinational companies came to have their headquarters in Hong Kong because it was such a useful position. It gave you access to all of China, but also it was a great jumping point for Southeast Asia and even beyond if you were taking the long journey down to Australia. So it's a place of trade. Initially, it was a place of disease and sickness until sanitation was sorted out. The Chinese population was initially quite small, as well as the British population, but that grew significantly with a series of rebellions around the 1850s and 60s, particularly the Taiping Rebellion. And a large number of Chinese refugees fled to Hong Kong. And that's a theme that comes up again and again, that people come to Hong Kong to escape something, as well as being drawn to the trading possibilities of the colony. So the colonial governance, it was under a governor as a colony, and the governor was advised by a legislative council. And it was deeply unequal. The legislative council initially only include British people. You won't be surprised to hear it did admit Chinese from the 1880s, but it was only an advisory council, so they didn't have any real influence, and there was no direct elections. Those representatives were appointed. And a symbol of the kind of racial inequality is Victoria Peak, which is depicted here in an early engraving from the 1850s. Very beautiful. If anyone's been to Hong Kong, you'll have definitely gone up Victoria Peak and had a look at the panoramic views to be had there. In the early days before air conditioning and so on, it was also a real haven from the heat of subtropical Hong Kong. So Europeans wanted to go out there, and the very rich would establish their residences there. But the only way up until 1888 was to be carried in a sedan chair. And these are some 20th century photographs of people being carried in sedan chairs. And it's a bit like the rickshaw as a symbol of inequality in Shanghai. In Hong Kong, the symbol of that inequality really is a sedan chair. The people were climbing up these very steep hills with the burden of carrying a European in this sort of luxurious chair. And so that I think epitomizes the racial inequality. The peak itself was reserved explicitly only for European residences between 1908 and 1930. So it was forbidden for Chinese to live there, except of course if they were live-in servants in those European residences. And also the funicular railway or funicular tram that was built in 1888 at busy times, that was also reserved only for Europeans. So Chinese were expected to just walk up this steep hill. And those are just a couple of examples of the deep inequality that existed, as you would expect in a colony in this era, particularly one marked by racial difference. Which leads to a sense of who belonged in Hong Kong. And the British tended to maintain the attitude that the Chinese had come there of their own free volition. And so they could leave and go back to China if they wanted to. All of those, the vast majority had arrived since it became a British colony, vast majority. They were refugees from various rebellions and wars, or they had come for the economic opportunities. So the government just didn't see why they should provide anything for them. And so a lot of Chinese kept a foot in the mainland. So wealthy Chinese sent their children to schools in mainland cities for a classical Chinese education, which they thought would be better than a British education. And people maintained extensive kinship family networks. So they embedded themselves in Hong Kong society in various ways, but they also were very clear that they had links back to mainland China. And similarly, the British always had a sense of home with a capital H, and that was Britain. So they would also be sending their children back to the UK for education. And a lot of people who lived in Hong Kong in the late 19th and 20th century were expats who would spend maybe a few years living in Hong Kong, a few years living in Shanghai, maybe move on to Kenya or hop down to Australia. There was a real sense of this being a mobile population, as well as there also being people who had lived there for growing numbers of generations as time went on. So you can see how you have all of these different senses of identity. Now that inequality sparked the first major unrest in Hong Kong in 1922, the Seamen strike, when Chinese sailors demanded a bit more in terms of equality and equal pay with their European counterparts. European sailors were paid 75 to 80% more than Chinese sailors. And so they demanded a 40% pay rise, which seems quite modest in that context. The colonial government declared it an illegal protest, but the sailors networked, and effectively there was a general strike, and the colony ground almost to a halt. And in the end, the employers granted up to a 30% pay rise. So it was a victory really for the seamen. And gradually after that, you start to see a small degree of signification of positions in Hong Kong companies and the civil service and the police, where you start to see more promotions of Chinese through particularly the 1930s and beyond. But it's a very slow process, and there's plenty of British people who see no reason at all why that should happen. Skipping ahead then to Hong Kong in war. First of all, in the First World War, I've mentioned this idea of home with a capital H, and so plenty of British Hong Kongers went to Europe to fight, but also some Chinese volunteered to fight. Not many, but it did happen. In the Second World War, the war broke out earlier in Asia in 1937, and Hong Kong was declared neutral. And it maintained that neutrality after the outbreak of the war in Europe, which is an interesting differentiation. Again, if you think about identity and belonging, the British Empire allowed that degree of variation. So Hong Kong could be neutral even while Britain was at war with the Axis powers. That came to an end in 8th of December 1941 with the Japanese invasion, the same day as Pearl Harbor. And there was not much room for resistance on the British part. The Japanese just had far superior forces, and the British surrendered on Christmas Day. And so most Allied nationals were interned in prisoner of war camps. So on the right here, you've got a picture of a camp that was set up at Stanley Beach. And the conditions in those camps were pretty dire, as you would imagine. So there was certainly malnourishment, at times famine, and a great deal of sickness and suffering. But obviously, in the end, with the Japanese surrender in 1945, those prisoners of war were freed, and Hong Kong returned to British rule. Now, the US had put pressure on Britain to renounce its control of Hong Kong during the Second World War. During that time, Britain did renounce its right to the treaty ports in China and its extraterritorial legal position in China. But Churchill was not going to countenance letting go of Hong Kong. He felt it was too strategically useful. And through the period we've just covered, Hong Kong is plodding along, but actually it fell behind economically to its northern counterpart, Shanghai, which became, particularly in the 1920s and 30s, an incredibly wealthy port, and Hong Kong fell into its shadow a little bit. That reverses in the post-war period, of course, with the communist victory in mainland China in 1949. So the population of Hong Kong in 1945 at the end of the war was about 600,000. And then with the communist victory in 1949, around 100,000 Chinese from the mainland were fleeing into Hong Kong every month, swelling the population to, by the mid-50s, around 2.2 million. And it had, because it's quite a small area, among the highest population densities in the world, and that obviously brings difficulties. So there was a water shortage. The area just simply didn't have enough fresh water, and so various wells were dug, freshwater reservoirs were built. They used seawater for flushing toilets. And then from 1960, they were actually able to import water from communist China. So that border, even though it's a very hard border in some senses between the communist and the capitalist world in the Cold War, was porous enough for water. And the People's Republic of China never used that. They could have just turned off the taps, literally, and they didn't do that. But among the other pressures was simply population density. Now, it was a very laissez-faire government. The attitude still in the mid-20th century was the government isn't, it's going to be very, very low tax, extremely low taxation. I've met a millionaire in Hong Kong who boasted that he's never paid income tax, so no problem with that. And as a consequence had very little money to spend on welfare of any kind. And there's also very little in the way of regulation, whether it's of finance and currency exchange or building regulations. And so you have this fascinating walled city of Kowloon that grows up. Now this is an area just over 6 acres, so it's pretty small. It was originally that Song dynasty garrison of around 1000 AD, and it was occupied by some squatters before and after the war. The Japanese used it as a garrison again, and then as the population exploded in the early 50s, it grew and grew and grew, and everyone just built their own little apartment on top of each other with no regulation, no oversight at all. The only real regulation was that you couldn't go above 14 stories because it was in the flight path of Hong Kong Airport. And so it's this kind of organic city that emerges, and this is an illustration of the conditions that people lived in. So the people who were unfortunate enough to live on the interior or the bottom layers had no natural light because all of the other apartments enclosed around them, they it was incredibly crowded and dense and unpleasant. But it's kind of an interesting example of what can happen when there's no governmental oversight, because people did organize to have their own wells and water system. And they policed each other to make sure people didn't overuse water, and they didn't overuse electricity, which was needed to pump the water out of the wells. Now, it's a haven for crime. The police were actually either afraid to go in or too corrupt to go in and deal with the crime, a bit of both. And the triads were among the groups who had fled to Hong Kong. A lot of people who fled were capitalists, were entrepreneurs, business people, but also criminal elements who fled to Hong Kong. But the triads also organized, stepped into the governmental law, and so they organized rubbish collection and a volunteer fire brigade and all sorts of things. So it's just a really interesting example. It was finally demolished in the early 1990s with compensation paid to the residents, but some people are quite nostalgic for it as this incredibly tight-knit community. So whilst that's going on, and that kind of inequality, where you've got massive wealth and massive poverty next to it, and then in the context of protests around the world in the 1960s, but in China, the Cultural Revolution, you have the outbreak in 1967 of the Hong Kong riots, and these were anti-imperial protests, which were pretty violent. They were communist-led. And there was a hard, brutal police crackdown on the protesters. And so a police officer was killed, some civilians were killed, there were bombs set off, homemade bombs. There were allegations, the police claimed that bombs were being made in some left-leaning schools, and so those schools were closed down. It was believed that Beijing was behind the protests. It wasn't in any organized sense, but it did support them, and it published, the official press in mainland China supported the protests, but there were rumors in Hong Kong that the Chinese government was going to come back and claim Hong Kong back from the British. And this is the only real protest movement against British colonial rule in the whole colonial era, and it's fairly short-lived, and it leads gradually to some improvements in welfare in the 1970s. So there's the beginnings of what becomes a very good public housing program. They introduced 9 years of compulsory education. New protections are introduced for employment. So really employers could do anything to you that they liked up until the 70s, but after this you're entitled to sick pay, redundancy pay, a day off a week, such luxuries. So the protests did make a difference, but they didn't impact the stability of British colonial rule. And certainly in this era, China was constantly looking at Hong Kong as a kind of thorn in its side. You know, Communist China was very anti-imperialist in its foundations and in its general stance internationally. So this is a communist propaganda poster from just before the outbreak of the Cultural Revolution. Imperialists and all reactionaries are paper tigers. And so British and American imperialists are the main ones that are targeted, but the Soviets were also called imperialists after the Sino-Soviet split in 1960s. So there's a lot, you know, China itself is very isolated in this era. But long term, there is an assumption both in China and in the British authorities in Hong Kong that long term Hong Kong's going to have to go back to Chinese rule. But the British don't expect that to happen anytime soon. They start to notice in the late 70s that there's some legal problems because of that 99-year lease. So all leases that are issued on buildings in the new territories or land obviously can't extend beyond 1997 because legally the land will not be British after that point. So they are casting around for some kind of fudge that could deal with that. They certainly expected in the 70s that British rule would extend beyond that point of 1997. But when they begin to explore this with the Chinese government in the early 80s, it becomes clear that that is not Beijing's intention. And Deng Xiaoping, the de facto leader of Hong Kong in 82, meets with Margaret Thatcher and makes it very clear that Hong Kong will be coming back to China. So they have secret talks. Thatcher flies out to have those talks, and there's no consultation of what people in Hong Kong think, neither the British nor the much larger Chinese population. And although there has been, as I said, opposition to colonial governance in Hong Kong, by this point, people are fairly satisfied with the status quo and with the status quo, but they're certainly very unhappy at the idea of being brought under communist rule. And that only intensifies, of course, in 1989 with the Tiananmen protests and the crackdown on Tiananmen Square and the massacre. And large numbers of Chinese dissidents flee to Hong Kong. So yet again, it's a place of refuge. And so people in Hong Kong are extremely unhappy that above their heads, the British government has agreed to return control over their lives to a communist government. But that is what is agreed in 1982. The basis of the handover agreement is summed up as one country, two systems. And the idea is that for 50 years, the basic system that operates in Hong Kong will be unchanged. So it will continue to be capitalist. It will continue to have its own currency. It follows British common law. It operates under a rule of law system, which does not apply in mainland China. So all of the important things would remain unchanged, but it is one country with China. Now that slogan was originally devised for application to Taiwan, which is the bigger prize Beijing always had its eye on. They want Taiwan back. They want Taiwan back much more than they ever wanted Hong Kong back. Partly Hong Kong is a test case for what could happen if Taiwan were ever brought back into China. And so people in Taiwan watch what's going on in Hong Kong with interest. And Handover was greeted with both celebrations and trepidation as Hong Kongers wondered what would happen next. But initially, one country, two systems absolutely worked. There had been moves towards a degree of democratization prior to the handover, only at district and municipal level with the direct elections, but then a degree of kind of popular participation in politics. And that is maintained by Beijing, but it's gradually eroded a little bit. And that's where we come to the pro-democracy movements. So first of all, in 2014, the peaceful umbrella movement, which you may remember, that was sparked by the government deciding that they were going to have a right to pre-approve anyone who was going to stand for election in 2017. And it was a peaceful protest. The umbrellas emerged because the police response was very brutal. They used tear gas and they shot and killed an unarmed protester. And in response, the protesters held up their yellow umbrellas against the tear gas. And so that became the emblem of the movement. And it did work. That law was rescinded. But the wider demands that people got very excited. It was a very optimistic, youthful, positive movement. People became swept up and wanted more. Then when the pro-democracy movement emerged in 2019, that was sparked. There had been arrests in 2017 of protesters, and so there was a sense that the rule of law in Hong Kong was being seriously eroded. And so there was a new protest, and this time there was much less optimism. There was a sense that the movement of 2014 had not worked and the peaceful tactics had not worked. And so there's a wing of the more recent protest movement which was violent and thought the more direct action was needed. And that, of course, allowed the police to portray them all as anarchists and the government to crack down very, very hard. But at one point, the movement was huge. The biggest protest, it's estimated 2 million people took part. And that's out of a population of less than 7.5 million. So it was an absolutely broad movement, very, very popular. And when local elections were held, the pro-democracy parties had a landslide victory. And this scared the Hong Kong authorities, but even more the Beijing authorities. And so the crackdown was extremely harsh. We have the national security law that was brought in, which I'll come to in a moment. But I just want to say before then, to be balanced, although there was a lot of genuine and ideological demand for rule of law and more meaningful adherence to the principles of one country, two systems, and some people wanting to push much more for real democracy, it's mixed up with a lot of general dissatisfaction with some of those inequalities that have never gone away in Hong Kong. The cost of housing is amongst the highest in the world, and young people have no prospect of buying their own home, which is a familiar story for those of us in Dublin. But also there was a lot of anti-mainland prejudice. By this point, it's very normal for Hong Kong Chinese to identify as Hong Kongers, not as Chinese, and they really look down on mainland Chinese, and they think they're a cultural threat as they continue to come into Hong Kong for the economic opportunities it afforded. So there's this very ideological umbrella, if you'll excuse the pun, to this movement, but there is also a less ideological underbelly to it. The national security law was brought into force just 1 hour before the anniversary of the handover from British rule on the 1st of July last year. So that's not a coincidence. So that is always the context for what's going on here. And it criminalizes any hint of secession from Chinese rule, subversion of the government, terrorism, and the definition of terrorism extremely broad, so vandalism is included. So one of the things the protesters have done was attack public transport buildings and government buildings. That's then classed as terrorism rather than a lower level of crime, and collusion with foreign powers. And there's basically a belief that this protest movement is backed by foreign powers, even though it seems to be a genuinely organic movement. And so this really is the end of rule of law in Hong Kong. And in terms of revisiting our themes of borders and so on, it means that the border in some ways between Hong Kong and China is less significant than it once was. But as you can see here, it's a contemporary photograph, it is still a very meaningful border. You still have to show your passport or ID card. With the coronavirus outbreak last year, there was dissatisfaction in Hong Kong because the border wasn't closed more quickly. And that allowed people who are infected to COVID to bring it to Hong Kong, and it was only closed quite late in the process. And that was a political decision that Beijing wanted to kind of maintain, that this is all one country, and so the border wasn't going to be closed. Eventually it was. And then it's incredibly quick now to cross between Hong Kong and China. So there's been huge investment in infrastructure. This beautiful bridge, one of the longest bridges in the world, that connects Hong Kong, Macau, and the mainland. And then a super fast train directly from Hong Kong to Shenzhen, just across the border, which takes only 15 minutes. Now you still need to show your passport or ID card when you get to the other side, but that does erode the significance of the border and brings them meaningfully closer together. But identities have never been further apart, I would suggest, than they are now. And a sense of belonging, there's this very strong sense of belonging to Hong Kong. People are very sad to see Hong Kong changing. There are very large numbers of Hong Kong Chinese who are expected to leave the jurisdiction. And it's interesting to see where they choose to go to, because anyone born before 1997 has been granted by the British government the right to settle in Britain for 5 years and seek British citizenship. So 3 million Hong Kongers have that right now. A survey has found that 600,000 of them would like to do that. The British government expects perhaps 300,000 to do it in the next 5 years. Already, 34,000 Hong Kongers have applied for British settlement or have moved to the UK. So that shows that even though we're 24 years after the handover, it's still the ties to Britain for some people are still there, those bonds. But whether they would be there if things were better in Hong Kong politically is another question. Some protesters held up the British colonial flag of Hong Kong, not many, and it was a bit of an own goal to do so, but it shows that there is a nostalgia, maybe even a false nostalgia, among young people for an era before Chinese communist rule in Hong Kong. So it's a very interesting time to be looking at Hong Kong. At the moment, there is not that sense of belonging to China, but it could well come. People in mainland China are broadly very content with their government, acknowledge its shortfalls, but basically think they're worth it because of the prosperity and improvements in living conditions. And we could well see in another generation that people in Hong Kong are also content with Chinese rule, but that's yet to see. So I'll leave it there, and I know I've covered a lot of ground, so thank you for bearing with me, but I'd really welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Isabella. That was really fascinating, and you took us through that very well. If you just actually stop screen sharing them.